It's nothing new to see Tadej Pogačar on the attack.
Tadej Pogačar blasts off looking for glory, looking for immortality as a champion of champions.
But there's something a little different about the way he's attacking this season. He appears to be staying seated a lot more in those initial accelerations. Is it deliberate? Is there a scientific reason that makes it somehow better? Is it something that others will copy or that we, as mere mortals, should be doing ourselves? I've been doing some digging and asking those in the know.
Maybe you cannot create that peak you would do in terms of standing sprint, but you can hold the power output demand a lot longer, like 30 seconds, even up to 1 minute.
It forms a key part of the conditioning when it comes to athletes at this level, but also for anybody who wants to just participate in cycling.
In road racing, it is commonplace to attack out of the saddle. It allows you to put more power through the pedals, therefore accelerating quicker and hopefully putting a gap into your rivals so they're not in your slipstream. Tadej Pogačar is the best cyclist of recent times, possibly ever. He too has made plenty of out-the-saddle accelerations, more than I care to remember. But this season, whilst the attacks are still numerous, he appears to be doing more of them in the saddle. At Strade Bianche, he dropped Tom Pidcock without getting out of the saddle. At Flanders, Flèche and Liège, his winning moves were all made in the saddle and nobody could follow. Now, there are still some examples of him attacking out of the saddle this year. He did so multiple times at Milano-San Remo and again at the Dauphiné for one of his winning moves there. So it's not a complete shift, but it has been noticeable. So is it a planned change, or are we making something out of nothing? I should probably start with what Pogačar has said himself about this. So when asked at a press conference at the recent Dauphiné, he said, "Not really. Everyone says I sit a lot, even when delivering a lot of power, but that's the way I always ride. If you want to give an extra punch, you have to stand on the pedals, but yesterday the pace was already very high for the real attack. Then you don't have to stand up to pedal a few more watts and accelerate. It depends on the course, but I like to stay seated." Well, I spoke to UAE's head of performance, Jeroen Swart, to ask him whether, in his opinion, there has been a change, or it's simply a natural evolution in how Pogačar is riding.
I don't think they're necessarily intentional, but they are a product of the work that we've done, and some changes that have been made. So it's a little bit of a multifactorial thing that's going on. Tadej has done a lot of both on the bike strength work and off the bike strength work, and we spoke about that before. One of the limitations in power production is your ability to produce torque. So torque is the force that you're applying to the crank, and then the velocity, which is the cadence, go in combination, and the two of them constitute power. And so if you're able to produce torque at a lower cadence or at the same cadence, you're producing a higher power output. But to produce torque, you need to be able to apply the force. And when you are seated and you apply a particularly heavy force, you lose stability. And if you're able to maintain stability by having better strength and also using the smaller muscle groups, you can do that for higher power outputs while still in the saddle. The reason you get out of the saddle is to try to produce a higher power output against what is an increasing resistance from the crank arm to wanting to turn over. And so you use your body weight. So when you get out the saddle, what you're effectively doing is transferring your body mass from one pedal to the other. It's almost like climbing a flight of stairs. You stand on one pedal, your mass actually helps you get the pedal down to the bottom of the crank rotation, and then you transfer your weight to the other side. Now, when you're seated, you can't do that. You have to rely on the force and holding the pelvis steady and then using the muscles in the leg to rotate the crank. And if you can create more stability by having done more strength work, you can do that for longer. And that's effectively what you're saying. It means that when he is attacking in the saddle, he's still got some physiological reserve, which he could probably use by getting out of the saddle. There is a second part to that, and that is the shorter crank arms that a lot of the professional peloton have gravitated to, and Tadej is also using a shorter crank. And a shorter crank requires, to achieve the same power output, will require a slightly faster rotation because you're producing less torque because the lever is shorter. And it's easier to produce a higher cadence in the saddle than out of the saddle. So there's a trade-off there in terms of benefit to stay seated for longer. And that's what you're also picking up. So it's a combination of those two elements that is producing the seated attacks versus getting out of the saddle.
So it sounds like there is reason to believe that Pogačar is remaining seated more of the time, and that is down to the strength work that he's been doing both on and off the bike, as well as his shorter cranks. But buckle up, because Jeroen then went on to say that there is also a physiological benefit to shifting positions, i.e. getting out of the saddle when it comes to lactate utilisation.
I was at a conference about 15 years ago, and they were presenting some data on cross-country skiing. And, 20 years ago, everybody was talking about lactic acid, the poisonous lactic acid that hurts you. And we now know that that's not the case. Lactate is actually a fuel. It's a byproduct to help you maintain your metabolic rate when you're not able to convert oxygen and substrate into carbon dioxide and energy. And so what they picked up is I don't know how they got this through ethics, but they cannulated the athlete's femoral artery and their femoral vein, which are two veins and arteries which are about that size. They cannulated the brachial artery and vein in the arm. And then they looked at cross-country skiers and looked at what happened when they skied without poles on an uphill treadmill, so this huge treadmill. And then they looked at the data again when the athlete was using the poling action. And they measured the lactate that was going into the legs, so in other words, what was left in the arterial system, and then what was coming back, in other words, being drained from the legs, and vice versa from the arms. And when they used their arms to pole, the athlete was able to achieve a higher maximal speed or power output. And when they looked at the concentrations of lactate, they saw that in the leg, there was a net production of lactate. So the veins draining the leg had a higher concentration of lactate. But paradoxically, going into the arm, they showed the opposite. So the arms were actually utilizing lactate. And that's what you're able to do. Lactate acts in some ways like a shuttle. And you're basically delivering that lactate to another part of your body, which is still working sub-maximally and able to use it as a fuel and combine it with oxygen and turn it back into pyruvate, then combine it with oxygen and burn it. And that way you can actually lower your whole body lactate concentration. And getting out of the saddle does the same thing as well to some extent. And you see that in cross-country mountain biking, where you see them often out the saddle on a climb. There are other factors there as well in terms of how you apply the power and so on. But it can have a net benefit because you can actually end up burning off some lactate that you would otherwise not be able to do if you were seated. So there sometimes is that additional benefit of standing. There's a complex dynamic of a bunch of different things interacting when you sit versus stand.
I've actually re-listened to what Jeroen said there a few times now, and I think I've got my head around it. Although it sounds contradictory actually to the style in which Pogačar is currently riding, doesn't it, which is predominantly seated. I also spoke to Jayco-AlUla coach Peter Leo, who explained the physiological and biomechanical differences between the two positions.
Obviously, you have a lot more explosivity because you change the center of mass when you go out of your saddle, and you are able actually on a short period of time for a peak to generate a lot more higher forces out of the seat. That's what we know from road sprinters. When they actually go and launch their sprint, they always do it out seated. But when you look more on the sustained effort, actually that out of the seat becomes pretty inefficient after 15-20 seconds. So you cannot hold that long because your oxygen costs goes up, because your drag reduction increases, because you just have a higher frontal area or more frontal area around you. And that's why Caleb Ewan was pretty famous for his new sprinting style, going really low while standing, to just actually reduce the drag area. So the drag area is a major factor limiting the sustained speed and power output from a standing sprint. Whereas a seated sprint, which we know actually from track cycling, all the track cyclists do seated sprints. So you need to have a very, very good seated torque ability from your glutes, from your glute muscles, just from all the activation kinetic chain to sustain a sprint. Maybe you cannot create that peak you would do in terms of standing sprint, but you can hold the power output demand a lot longer, like 30 seconds, even up to 1 minute, where, this is almost goes more like into a lead out kind of demand and lead out requirement.
One of the things that I'd pondered to myself was whether Pogačar has simply got more savvy and more patient in racing. There were times in the past when he just seemed to attack anywhere, even when it wasn't the best time to do so, whereas now things seem a lot more calculated. So I put that to both Jeroen and Peter.
Pogačar was always a very aggressive rider, and I think he never really thought too much about if he should attack or not. But I would say what became obvious watching him into the races, and obviously his dominant, is that he's doing these attacks way more calculated and way more with a greater precision at the right timing. I think in the past you could literally see, obviously only from the television and the couch potato point of view, but you could just see he was literally so strong that he tried to go every time, whereas now he actually is more selective on at the points where he is going. And yes, I think if you look at the way he finishes the races, almost 80-90% of his wins is solo. So he takes very, very long surges over like 40, 50, 60. I don't know even what the longest distance was he covered alone. But it's obvious that he likes to go very early now, which has an influence on the race tactics of other teams as well, because you can hardly control when he's in the race. It became obvious this year that he's even going earlier, but with a greater precision. And he seems to be very aware of when he goes, rather than in previous years. He rode by instinct more.
As a rider ages, they're going to become more savvy, and that's also going to be an advantage for them. So I'm sure we're seeing that to some extent as well.
Now, along with speaking to a couple of experts, I've also been doing a bit of my own research, or rather looking at research that's already been done. So a study published in the International Journal of Exercise Science back in 2020 looked into the physiological and biomechanical differences between seated and standing uphill cycling. They had 10 elite male participants who did 3 uphill efforts of 5 minutes each on a treadmill, either seated, out of the saddle, or a combination of the two. And they found no difference in oxygen uptake, metabolic rate, or gross efficiency between those 3 options. But what they did find was that combined seating and standing effort resulted in significantly lower post-exercise blood lactate levels. Other studies, though, have shown higher oxygen use and heart rate when standing versus seated. And there have also been biomechanical studies that have shown higher peak power when out of the saddle, but at a mechanical cost, i.e. greater rolling resistance and the lack of efficiency of a bike that's swaying from side to side. Anthony Bouillot and Fred Grapp also conducted a well-cited field study comparing seated versus standing during uphill time trials. Amongst the 13 elite cyclists, there was no significant difference between seated and standing positions in terms of oxygen consumption, but whilst power increased by around 4.5% whilst standing, rider speed actually remained very similar. The mechanical cost, though, rose too. They found it was 48% more mechanically efficient to stay seated, which is huge. They concluded that getting out of the saddle allows cyclists to maintain speed on climbs by allowing them to use a higher torque and lower cadence, but it does come at a mechanical and aerodynamic cost. And the latter is, of course, quite a big consideration at the kind of speeds in which Pogačar is climbing.
The riders are climbing at higher speeds than ever before, and we do know that even at 25 kilometers an hour, aerodynamic drag is an important factor. So yes, seated attacks are going to be more efficient from an aerodynamic perspective. Whether or not there's any intention in that, I don't think so. I think it's just an additional benefit that you've noticed and that there is research to support. So it stands to reason that it's not a bad strategy to actually employ that.
I think there is a strong shift not only in Pogačar, but most of the climbers, GC guys going to shorter cranks. I think Pogačar is now at a 165, whereas even Vingegaard goes also very, very short. I think there was a video of Vingegaard going almost on 160 cranks or what it was. That had an implication on the way he rides, and you see in his aero position style that he and his bikes looks really, really connected. Just also from his hip angle and stuff. So I think they made some changes in his bike setup, which probably changed his riding style. Yeah.
So that's what the experts had to say. But another thought that I had is that there could, and probably is, a psychological impact on his rivals. Any of you who've ridden a bike in a group will know that if the going gets tough on a climb and the person in front of you is still seated, it gives the impression that they're very much in control. They haven't got close enough to their limit to warrant getting out of the saddle for the extra leverage and power. I mean, it's never nice to see somebody in front of you ride away when you're at or above your limit, but when they're seated, that's going to hurt even more. I mean, personally, I doubt Pogačar is doing it for that reason, but you never know. Just before I continue, if you're enjoying this video, it helps us massively if you click on the thumbs up button that you'll find just below it, and also if you subscribe to the channel. We've got plenty more content coming that I know you're going to love. Now, the last thing I wanted to ask both Jeroen and Peter was whether us mere mortals can learn anything from Pogačar's style. Would there be any benefit to us training ourselves to spend more time seated?
Is there anything that they can take away from Pogačar's seemingly more seated accelerations this year, especially if they're starting to use shorter cranks themselves? Is it something that it's worth thinking about for them?
Yeah, I think obviously there is a huge interest now. I think if you talk to bike suppliers like Shimano and others, like they're pretty much sold out with all the short cranks because there's a run on short cranks. It was similar than when Kipchoge ran the Alpha Fly. Everyone's going to buy the Alpha Fly, and still you were an average runner despite the Alpha Fly. So I think at the end of the day, I would still say, well, if this is an interest to actually explore, why not? But then you got to have a bit of a plan in place to switch to cranks, because it's not like, at the end of the day, going from 172 to 170, we're talking about 2.5 millimeters. And if we go to 167.65, we're talking about 7.5 millimeters. So actually, it's not that much. Still, biomechanically, if you look at the hip angle and how it influenced the rest of the cycling posture, it has an impact, you know. And so I think if you want to make that switch, always do it in conjunction with a bike fitter, with a very experienced professional who actually knows what to adapt in terms of cleat position, in terms of seat height, and so on, to just make it comfortable so you don't create any overuse knee injuries. Because the biggest risk is if you have done 5,000, 10,000 kilometers on 172 and you go straight to 165 and you don't give your time to adopt, it's risky. And it's the risk of overuse and stuff, especially around the knee, is a thing. So I would recommend do it slowly. Ideally, you do it during off season, you know, where you had a break and you can ease in with some turbo session, and you can try it with shorter sessions over the winter. You get used to it, you get optimized, and then when you go into the spring, you ramp up your volume and you gradually do that, rather than all of a sudden you see it in the tour and next week you're back on the short cranks. I would not advise that to any recreational cyclist.
Practicing staying seated on a difficult climb for as long as possible is always going to make you better at doing something. Like most things, you know, if you want to be good at chopping wood, go and chop wood. If you want to be good at seated climbing, practice it. And it is going to be beneficial. It gives you an extra arrow in your quiver. And so it forms a key part of the conditioning when it comes to athletes at this level, but also for anybody who wants to just participate in cycling. There's a benefit to actually doing that. If you look at a very inexperienced cyclist and you watch and ask them to ride at a high cadence, you'll see them bouncing around in and out of the saddle. They'll look like, and people say they look like they're pedaling squares, and they literally are. And that's because at the bottom dead center, when you're just about to turn on your hamstrings, you're still contracting your quadriceps. And that efficiency in turning on the right muscle at the right time is a neurological mechanism. So that's trainable. So there's an actual nervous system training that happens. There's a muscular training, and that is the smaller muscle groups, the weaker muscle groups like the hamstrings, the muscles on the front of your lower leg, your tibialis anterior, and those muscles actually strengthen so you can produce more force with them. And so there's a whole bunch of different training adaptations that happen in response to doing those drills. And they all go into benefiting you from having a smoother pedal stroke, less loss of energy. So there's a greater efficiency, to being stronger and being able to maintain it at a higher power output, and so on.
It really was fascinating to talk to both Jeroen and Peter on this subject. I really cannot wait to watch the upcoming Tour de France. Speaking of which, you can catch a full season of bike racing live on Discovery Plus and Max. But I'd love to hear your own thoughts on this as well. Personally, I'm going to double down on my strength exercises in the gym, and I'm going to try spending more time in the saddle during training. Anyway, do you have your own theories as to why Pogačar isn't attacking out of the saddle as much? Do you think we're making something out of nothing? Let me know in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you very soon.